Well, what I wanted to do today was kind of a light thing. I wanted to retrace some of my steps that I've gone through with the Lord in terms of coming to know Him, and some things that just blew my mind as I was first exposed to what Christianity is, who Jesus is. He called me to Himself. It actually was 40 years ago this year. Whew. I know, I don't look that old. No. So that was 40 years ago. But when I became a believer, it was an amazing event because at that point, God seemed to go through a whole sequence of things in my life that changed. I had a very stable life up till then. I mean, lived in the same house, everything was pretty much the same. And then I gave my life to the Lord, and then everything changed. Principally, which 5 months, 6 months later, we moved from the house I was living in, and suddenly we were living overseas. That was kind of a shocker, but God used that to do some amazing things. And then while I was overseas, our youth group that was in our church said, you know what, this was in England, we're just a stone's throw from Israel. Let's go to Israel and see what Israel's all about. So within a year becoming a believer, actually it was a little bit later than that, I had the chance to go to Israel. If you've never gone to Israel, you really ought to try. It's an astonishing experience in so many ways. But I was there as a teenager. And so I wanted to retrace my steps with you a little bit because what God did while I was there changed the whole foundation of what I believe and why. I found out that this whole Jesus dying and resurrecting thing, especially the dying part, wasn't an accident. It wasn't where God was sleeping at the wheel one day and whoops, oh, they killed him. Darn, we'll have to fix that. And He fixed it. It was actually the very deliberate plan of God. And I found that out in this trip to Israel. So I'm going to take you on a brief travelogue beginning with, and then we'll look at scriptures. Take a look at this right here. Here's a structure you'll see if you go to Israel. And the thing on the left looks like something from 2001, A Space Odyssey. And it's a monolith. It's a granite monolith. And on the right is a thing that looks like a thing. I don't know what you call it. This what's it look like? It looks like a... Yes. Oh, Hershey's Kiss. It must be a chocolate holiday today. Yes. Anyway, this right here happens to be the Israel Museum that's in Jerusalem. And it's a special place because, like in the United States, Congress and the Senate, they all hold their meetings in the city called Washington. And some of the most important documents to us in this country, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, are all held at a place called the Library of Congress, actually. Library of Congress. And it's actually very close to Congress. It's in the same place. Well, in Israel, a similar thing happened. The place where they have the highest security is where they have their parliament in part of West Jerusalem. Very high defensive location so that bad guys can't come in planes and blow it up. And then they built right next to it, about a block away, this structure. In that structure on the right are housed the most important documents in Israel. And when we're talking important documents, we're not talking about Israel's version of the Constitution. We're talking about the Bible, old translations of the Bible. So we went to this place, and we went over to that thing on the right there, and actually it's 2/3 of it is underground, and that's on purpose. It's actually a defensive vault as well as a museum to display these things. It closes up in a way, and if airstrikes come, nothing will harm them. Like if you go and see if you go to the Library of Congress, the Declaration of Independence is in a special case that at night they flip a switch, and the thing goes down through the ground into a concrete bunker, and it's protected. I mean, it's gone. But they wanted to bring it up so you could see it. Well, in here, there's stuff like that. So we go around to the right side over there, and we went inside, and the first thing that caught my eye when we came inside was this. It's in a glass case, it's in Hebrew, and it's called the Aleppo Codex. Now, as a 16-year-old, I looked at the Aleppo Codex and said, the Aleppo Codex? What is that? I mean, it sounds like one of the Marx Brothers. You got Groucho and Chico and Harpo and Aleppo. That's what it sounded like. So I looked at that and said, well, here's an old document. It's got a lot of Hebrew on it. What is it? So I started reading about it, and I knew that the Jews had, they used the Old Testament and the Bible, and it was in Hebrew and stuff like that. But there must be something special about this because they kept saying, this is a very special document. And our guide kept saying, yes, this is very special. Well, here's a few special things about it. It's the Old Testament in Hebrew, so if we try and figure out what is in the Old Testament, you want to start with a Hebrew text. Well, this particular Hebrew text was written in about the 900s AD, okay, 900s AD, so about 1,000 years before it was written. And it was written by some scribes in Tiberias, which is up on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. And they did a really careful job. If you zoom up on what's inside of it, you see that they did a really cool thing. Not only are there Hebrew characters there, but there's also little dot marks. Hebrew characters are only consonants. They have no vowels. Well, these guys in the 900s decided we need to preserve how these things are said, so we'll put vowel marks on. So these guys, they're called the Masoretes. They created the Masorah, is what they call it. They put these vowel marks on, and they created this incredibly stunning copy of the entire Old Testament. Now, if you look at some of the characters, you know, we are so jaded because of laser printers. I want you to look at how similar these characters are. For instance, take a look at this character here that looks like a W. See that? Now compare that to the one down here. And this one right here. Now the dots are different, but look how similar the inside of the character is. Very, very carefully constructed, all done by hand. And these guys were incredibly careful how they did this. 900s AD. And it's all done on animal skin, so it wouldn't go away. It's kind of cool. Wow, that's really neat. 1,000-year-old piece of the Old Testament. And then it turns out it had a funny history. About 100 years after it was penned, it ended up going down to Jerusalem, which is down in the south, and they used it down there to worship in a synagogue down there. And then it had a crazy history. Around 1099, this thing went to Cairo because of the crusade. Now, the Crusaders came into town. They took over Jerusalem. They took it back from the Muslims. And in the process, they said, oh, now we're in charge of this place. But they also did some nasty things. And one of the nasty things the Crusaders did was they held for ransom a whole bunch of Jews and a whole bunch of their most important writings. The Aleppo Codex was one that was held ransom. So when the Jews scattered because of that, it turns out they said, well, listen, we have this incredibly valuable-looking text. You guys want to buy it back from us, and we'll give it to you instead of burn it. And so it was ransom. They had to pay money to the Crusaders to get it out of their hands, and it went down to a synagogue in Cairo. 1099 is the year that the Crusaders came in and wrecked Jerusalem, okay? So now it gets ransomed. It goes down to a synagogue in Cairo, sits down there for a while, and it goes on its illustrious journey, and then suddenly it goes to Aleppo, Syria. That's how it gets its name. Aleppo, Syria in 1375. There's a synagogue up there that says, we want it, we want it. So it goes up to Aleppo, Syria. And then a funny thing happens. 1947, the nation of Israel becomes the nation of Israel. That's when they declared independence. And when they declared independence by United Nations writ, it turned out that all the Muslims throughout the Middle East went crazy. There was rioting everywhere, including in Syria, in the town of Aleppo. They burned the synagogue that this thing sat in, and the Jews carefully got it out of there and protected it and saved it from being burned. But at that point in 1947, the Aleppo Codex suddenly just went into hiding. Just went into hiding just to protect it so no one could hurt it anymore. And then finally, in 1958, it came out of hiding and it made its way back to Jerusalem. Then full circle again, the Aleppo Codex. And as I walked into the Israel Museum, they said, this is the Bible that has seen the world. It's gone all over the place. And our guide said, not only that, the Aleppo Codex is very important because it's the oldest Hebrew manuscript of the Bible that we have. And everyone went, wow. But he was sort of lying just to get us. Let me show you what it means because of this. Here's a timeline right here. A timeline with us over there on the right in 2010. And then 0 in the middle, kind of the cross where Jesus is right there, and then all the way to the left, 1400. That's about Moses, is 1400 BC. So everything on the left side of 0 right here is what we call BCE, before the Common Era, or what we used to call BC before Christ, which is very non-politically correct anymore, by the way. So everything before 0 there is BC or BCE. And then everything on the right side of the picture, for some reason, there it goes, is what we used to call AD, Anno Domini, Year of the Lord, but now it's CE, the Common Era. Okay, so you're kind of oriented where we are here. I want to show you where the Aleppo Codex comes from. You're saying, this is like school. Oh, no, this is cool. This is like Indiana Jones. Okay, here we go. So what happens is that the writers of the Old Testament all lived right down there between 400 and 1400 BC. Moses, the oldest guy of 1400. 400 about Malachi or the minor prophets, the last written stuff that goes into the Old Testament. So they're in that little span, those 1,000 years right there. And so they all write their stuff down. Write their stuff down. And as they write their stuff down, it gets collected together and forms a stream of copies of all this stuff that got written. Now, by the time it gets to us over here on the far right, we don't have any of the originals of what they wrote. We don't have any of the original parchments that have what they wrote on it. But fortunately, we have some copies. that spring up in funny places. And the Aleppo Codex comes up right here. It was a copy made of the Old Testament documents around the 900s AD. And so we get the Aleppo Codex. It travels all over the world, and then it eventually comes to us. We say, hey, it's cool. It's the oldest Hebrew text we have, the Old Testament. And I'm looking at the Aleppo Codex as a 16-year-old going, wow, this is the source of the entire Old Testament. This is the oldest. There is no older text for the Old Testament than this right here. It's written all here. All the books of the Old Testament are included in it. They did a sampling on the stream of the copies at 900. Man, that's it. That's all of them. And it's accurate. It's got everything we need. And then the guide said, well, not exactly. I went, ooh, what do you mean not exactly? Well, there's something older. Ooh, what is it? Well, here's what it is. It turned out then, we went down the hallway a little bit more toward the center of this dome right here. And he says, are you familiar with the Qumran caves? In 1947, some shepherd boys were around the Qumran caves and they were doing their shepherding thing, and they dropped a rock, it said, into a cave and heard something like pottery break inside. And so they found the cave. Actually, the Qumran caves in this picture are this knob of hills right here. The big blue thing on the top right, that's the top end of the Dead Sea, the top end of the Dead Sea. And so they went inside these caves, and here's cave number 1, and they went inside and they found some of these jars. Woohoo! Full of what? Grain and rice and soup? No, full of scrolls. Scrolls, written scrolls. Again, animal skins wrapped up, and on those animal skins they had cool stuff written on it in Hebrew. And since this is in such close proximity to that body of water on the top, they're called the exactly, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls. And by the way, I didn't mention to you, when I said the Aleppo Codex, codex just means book. It means instead of a scroll, they actually chopped it up and bound it like we do with books. It's kind of cool. But these are the scrolls, Dead Sea Scrolls. 1947, they were found. Now, look at the top of that jar. What does that look like to you? Look at Hershey's Kiss. No, it's, oh, come on, clicker, work today. There we go. It's that thing right there. So that building is built to be like a large jar to hold the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Ooh, got it? So as I saw that and I walked into the center of that, you go into the center of that room and you see this right in the center of that dome. It looks like a giant wooden scroll handle in the middle of that dome thing. And if I blow that up, well, actually what that is, there we go, blow that up. What they have unrolled in the middle there is what's known as the Great Scroll of Isaiah. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are fragments or pieces of every Old Testament book with the exception of Esther. Every book, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, all of them. And there's one that's incredibly well preserved. It's the entire book of Isaiah. If you took the scroll and rolled it out on the floor, you'd have the entire book of Isaiah as we have it today. And they decided this is such a treasure to our nation. We want people to see it and we want to protect it. So they unwrapped it around this lit thing under a very controlled condition. And as a 16-year-old, I walked up the steps and I looked at this thing and my nose was 1 inch away from the book of Isaiah. Now today, if you go there and see this, this is still there, but they've decided to take the real scroll and put it in a safer place. So now you see a replica. But when I was there, the museum had only been there for about 6 years, 5 or 6 years, and so they were still displaying this Isaiah scroll, this great Isaiah scroll. And I don't read any Hebrew, but I could look up to it and go, wow, this must be really old. And the guide said, yeah, let me show you how old. Let me show you why this is important. We already know the Aleppo Codex was a copy and a sample of what was existing around 900s AD. Well, where did the Dead Sea Scrolls fit into all these writings that are handed down on the bottom down there? Well, they said it's much younger or much older than the Aleppo Codex. It actually is right down here, somewhere in the couple hundred years before Christ. So we have an incredible opportunity because now that we've dug that out, we've put it on the shelves, we put it in the Israel Museum, we can at least do one incredible thing. We know that the versions of the scriptures between these 2 points, what they did was they copied them, meticulously copied them one after another. And when an old scroll on animal skin would get old enough that the ink on the letters would start to flake off, they'd say, oh, it's losing its integrity. Now, people might misread this because some of the ink's flaking off. We need to make a brand new copy. So they'd roll out the old one, they'd roll out animal skins over here, and letter by letter, they'd make a new copy over and over again. And then they would do cross checks. They'd count where the middle letter is here. They'd find where the middle letter is here. If that worked, they'd do all these checks. And finally, when they were all done and sure that the new copy was good and intact and integrity and high fidelity to the old copy, they take the old copy and burn it. So now we have a copy. So for these 1,000 years between this point of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Aleppo Codex, over and over, for 1,000 years, they copied and burned. They copied and burned. They copied and burned. Now, you've played the telephone game, right? Where you sit around in a circle and someone starts with a message, it goes in someone else's ear, and then they whisper something, and it gets to the very end, and they say, okay, what is it you heard? And they say something goofy, that's like, Bozo has ears. I don't know, at the very end. And then they compare what was said at the beginning, and it's never the same, because when you whisper, you go, well, what do you think 1,000 years of copies is going to look like when you start over there on the left with something, and you get some. This was a great test for textual critics to say, let's just see how good they copied over 1,000 years, because we have 2 copies made 1,000 years apart. And when they compared them, they were flabbergasted. And this is one thing that flabbergasted me as a 16-year-old. There are tiny, minute changes. Minute changes. Definitely has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on what's in the content of the books. Over 1,000 years, you can say, in reality, and we're not just making this up, these 2 documents are virtually the same. 1,000 years of non-xerographic copying by hand. Exactly the same. But that's not what was really the most exciting to me. I mean, it told me that, okay, so they wrote these things way over here, but what we have way over here must be very accurate because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which agreed with the Aleppo Codex, and it must be what they had. But what really intrigued me more than that was this. Since it's dated a couple hundred years before Christ, I wonder let me go back to that. I wonder what the implications are of having the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we know scientifically, linguistically predate Jesus by around 200 years. I wonder if that means anything. And the leader of our group, our youth group, said, well, it really is. He says, have you ever read this book? And he's pointing to Isaiah on the scroll. He was English. He said Isaiah. Have you ever read Isaiah? I said, well, I've read parts of it. He says, well, I want to direct your attention to one thing. So what he did was he said, let's go back to the scroll. So we're back to the scroll over here on the left. And we're going to unwrap the scroll for you right now. Here's the scroll. Actually, this is the real Dead Sea Scroll of Leviticus. I don't have a longer one for Isaiah, but it looks like this when you roll it out. And he said, okay, let's start at the beginning, which is actually on the right, and let's go forward, and let's find a section I'm looking for. We walked around it until we got over to a point, and he said, here it is, Isaiah 52. Oh, Isaiah 52. He says, do you know anything about Isaiah 52? I said, no, I don't. He says, well, let's read this. Now, he took out his Bible because he didn't read Hebrew very well either. And I want to do this with you. These are the actual words written a couple hundred years before Jesus comes on the scene. Isaiah 52. He says this, behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Talking about some kind of king or some kind of important person? Well, let's form our opinion as we go. He is God's servant. He'll prosper. That means he'll be successful. He'll be high and lifted up, which means that he'll have high authority. Verse 14, just as many were astonished at you, my people, so his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Saying that although he is this servant and a man of high authority in verse 13, in verse 14, people will be astonished at how disfigured and how marred he will be. Why, is he some kind of genetic freak? Well, let's wait and see. But something about him made his form, made it how he looked, marred more than any other man. And then he goes on in verse 15, and he says, thus he will sprinkle many nations. Sprinkling is a Jewish way of saying bless the nations. So he will bless not only the nation of Israel, but all the nations on the entire earth. That's what this means. The goyim, everyone who's not even Jewish too. He'll have a blessing effect on them. And the kings, that is, the highest men of authority, will shut their mouths on account of him. For what had not been told them, they will see, and what they had not heard, they will understand. So even the highest authorities on the earth, the kings on the earth, because of this man, will be speechless. Won't have a snappy comeback at all. That's how great this man's authority over all the kings of the earth. The kings on the earth. See, a king is someone, when you go into his presence, he's the only one allowed to speak. You don't speak unless you're spoken to in the presence of a king. What this is saying is that the kings of the earth hold their tongue in the presence of this one. So I'm looking at this thinking, gosh. And my friend said, well, who do you think that is? I could take some guesses, but he's very important. He serves God. He's going to be disfigured in some kind of way. And the kings of the earth are going to be silent. They'll be so overwhelmed by his authority. And my friend said, yeah, get an idea yet? I'm working on it. And then we went a little bit further down in the manuscript. And we got to Isaiah 53. Oh, let me just summarize this for you really quick. So he's God's servant. He'll be successful. He'll prosper. He'll be the greatest of authorities that the kings will shut their lips. He'll be horribly disfigured and marred for reasons we don't understand yet. He will actually bless many nations, not just Israel itself, and rulers will be speechless because of his authority. So now we skim down to Isaiah 53. We go down further. This is actually a blow-up of Isaiah right here. And Isaiah 53 starts in verse 1. So who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root before parched ground. He has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, no appearance that we should be attracted to him. So verse 1 says, this message is so unbelievable, who can believe it? It's an astonishingly amazing truth, I'm telling you. Who can believe this? This is incredible. Verse 2, he grew up before him like a tender shoot. That means he was like a little plant. It means he didn't come on the scene as a full-blown adult human. He came up in some very weak form, like a little shoot on a plant. You could step on it and kill it almost. And in hostile territory. You see what he said right there? Like a root out of parched ground. So like a plant, a seed that you plant right now in the spring and you forget to water that ground, and yet it still pokes its way up in a couple weeks or so, and you say, man, I don't know how it did that because all odds were against it. I never watered that ground. It's a parched piece of clay in my backyard, and it still poked its way through. So everything was going against this little seed growing up. Okay, hostile territory. No stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. That is, like the first thing he was marred, there's something about this man that you wouldn't look at him and say, now there's a king. You'd look at him and say, there's a something else, but that's no king. There was nothing naturally charismatic about how he looked that would make... Now, take that in contrast, for instance, if you know your Old Testament. Before David was king, the king was King Saul. And remember, the people said, we want a king, we want a king. And Saul was kind of a good-looking guy, heads above others, And they said, there's a king right there. Because he looked the part. He wasn't a great king, it turned out in the end. Well, what the writer here is saying is that this person, whoever he is, didn't have the Saul effect. I mean, you couldn't look at him and say, now there's a king. You'd walk right past him. He didn't look kingly in that sense. So we summarize this section as we're trying to figure out who this is. It's an astonishing truth what I'm going to tell you. Who's going to believe this message? It's just out of this world. He's going to grow up from a youth as a tender shoot. He's going to come out of very parched ground, which means it's going to be a hostile environment that he's going to grow up in. And on top of that, he's just not going to look like a king at all. By the way, you getting any ideas who this might be? Oh, don't say it. Let's go on. He took me around to the rest of the school. We went to verse 3 of Isaiah 53. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Sounds like he had a tough life. He wasn't universally popular, is what this is saying. He ought to be. This is God's servant, and he's going to bless many nations. But you know what? He had more than his share of sorrows and grief. Something broke his heart all the time. He was despised. Men wouldn't even face him. They weren't attracted to him. They wouldn't esteem him. Verse 4, surely our griefs he bore, our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. So now the writer of Isaiah himself says, and this is an interesting twist. This is a man whose heart will be broken all the time, sorrowful, grieving, and stuff like that. But you know whose sorrow and whose grief he's actually carrying? It's not his own. It's yours. So something about this man is the fact that in all of human experience, the things that burden us, that bring sorrow and grief, that weigh us down, he will take those, and he will experience them for us. It's our griefs. That's why he's sad. It's because of our griefs he carries those. Well, how does that work? How can you have a king who rules a country and who's going to make his whole populace happy because they're somehow going to have all their griefs and all their sorrows, all the heartaches of life, and they'll be put on him as a king, and then things will be fine? How can a king do that? That's kind of impossible, right? So you summarize this section and you say this: he was despised by men. He was rejected by men. He wasn't a universally attractive kind of guy. He had sorrows and grief, our sorrows and grief. He took them upon himself. It was our fault, not his, that he had those sorrows and grief. And it's something that God allowed, smitten by God and afflicted. God allowed this? Well, we move along the rest of the Isaiah scroll, verse 5. But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He was pierced through for our transgressions. What we do wrong. So we do something wrong, we ought to go to court and pay the price for it. But what happens is that somehow he pays the price for it. He gets the penalty for what we do wrong. Pierced through for our transgressions. Crushed for our iniquities. That word crushed is always the word that they used to use when you would actually crush gravel underfoot, or anything underfoot, just kind of, ah. And have you ever felt so burdened by the troubles of life that you feel like you're that gravel? You're being crushed underfoot? Well, he was crushed for us. Crushed for us. And then he says an amazing thing. By his scourging we are healed. You know what a scourging is? It's a beating with a very cruel device. It's like a whip. Really, it's sort of like a whip. And it's not like the whip of Indiana Jones, one of those things. But it's like a whip, but what it has is built into the leathers of the thong that make the whip are various things like chunks of bone and sharp rocks and stuff like that. Don't fly out of the whip, they stay with the whip. Gives it a nice kind of texture to kind of chew things up when you whip things with it. And they would scourge you by tying you to a tree and then taking this thing that had all these flesh biting chunks, and they would slap it across, and they would do it across you until it actually just tore up your back. That's a scourging, is what that is. Many times a scourging would kill you. It was so painful. It was definitely meant to be a public event, so everyone in the city would say, man, I never want to do whatever he did. This is a nasty deal. Well, he was scourged, but why? What did he do wrong? Nothing. In fact, he is scourged, which makes him bleed, and yet we get healed. He bleeds, we're healed. He has the flesh ripped off his back. He needs healing, but through it he heals us. What? I'm sure a Jew would read this in Isaiah and go, this is the craziest imagery I've ever... Don't you scourge someone because after all they're dirtbags and they do things like they stole someone from someone's house or they were caught in adultery or a whole number of things, and you scourge them and you make an example of them and you say, don't do that ever again, and you people don't ever do this again either. Oh! But how can you scourge someone and then through the process bring healing to everyone else? That's like goofy talk. So you summarize this section. He says, he was pierced for our transgressions, literally stabbed for our wrongdoing. Literally stabbed. He was annihilated. That's the crushed part. For our sin, not because of something he did himself. And yet we're the ones that benefit. We're the ones that get healed through the whole process of his going through the pain. And it's our wrongdoing. It's our selfish independence like sheep going astray that caused it. And he paid the penalty for that independence for all of us through all the stuff that he did. Who could this be? This is 200 years before the birth of Jesus. Who could this be? He goes on, verse 7. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he didn't open his mouth, which means that he didn't protest through the whole process. He went along with it, didn't whine while it went on. And like a lamb that is led to slaughter, like a sheep that is silent before its shears, and so he didn't open his mouth. He just let it happen. Verse 8, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. That is, during the time that he shows up, the magistrates and the people who judge for speeding tickets and theft and murder and all that kind of stuff. They said he deserves to be taken away. Take him out of here. He's guilty. That's what that line's saying. He's a guilty man. He's a guilty man. And for his generation who considered he was cut off out of the land of the living. Cut off out of the land of the living is a metaphor for death. Because, when you executed someone by chopping off their head with a sword, you're literally separating them from the land of the living, okay? It's a real physical thing. So this guy is going to be killed. Not just flogged, like we said before. Not just stabbed, like we said before. Actually killed. He's going to be cut off from the land of the living. And it also means that someone's going to do it to him. He's not going to take his own life. Someone is going to separate him from the land of the living. He's going to die. Now, you're reading through this as a Jew and you're thinking, well, wait. Didn't it say at the beginning this is God's servant? This is some kind of king who all the kings of the earth can't even make any snappy comebacks to. They're silent before him. He's some great authority. How can some great authority who all the kings of the earth, to whom all the nations of the world will find blessing, how is it that he can die? And it sounds like it's kind of deliberate. You hear that? He didn't protest. It was a voluntary walking to his own death. He was separated from life, that is, he died. And at the executioner's stroke, that was intended for us, not for him. For the transgression of my people, for us. So now we know that not only was he flogged when he shouldn't have been, we should have been, and not only do we know that he had grief and sorrow, but it wasn't his, it was ours he took upon himself. Now we know that he's going to die deliberately, voluntarily, won't raise a stink, won't say a word, won't whine on the way, sounds like it's part of the purpose, because of our transgressions. So this guy's going to die. Well, then how does the kingdom thing work if he's going to die? I mean, is it just going to be a short-lived kingdom and he's out of here? How's that work? I hope you're connecting some of this. Verse 9, his grave, so he is going to die, okay? His grave was assigned with wicked men. Yet he was with a rich man in his death. Because he'd done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. His grave was assigned with wicked men. That means, again, the people in charge said, this guy does not deserve a good burial. He deserves to be thrown in the mass burial where all the poor people and the bad people and the murderers and the thieves and stuff. He goes with all the bad people. His grave was assigned with the wicked. He's a wicked man. That's what people said. And then another strange thing, yet he was with a rich man in his death. So although the magistrates in the beginning of that verse said he deserves to be buried with the wicked people anonymously, yet he's going to be in a rich man's tomb, in a rich man's burial place. Now, in the ancient world, a rich man, when you had a burial place, you didn't go up here, and buy a lot in the cemetery and buy, a big, $25,000 bronze casket and all that kind of stuff. You didn't do that stuff. What you did was you made a place where it would be impossible for the animals to dig your bones out of the ground. You'd carve a hole out of the side of a rock mountain face. This is what the rich people did because they could afford it. And they would pay guys to go in there with chisels and hammers and hammer out a cave in a rock of a hillside. And then in that cave, you would make a place to lay bodies and sometimes little holes to put pieces. And then you have someone build bone boxes for you where your bones would go after you had decayed for a long time. And then to keep the bad people out, you'd make for yourself at a very high cost a stone that you could roll in front of the doorway, too hard to roll or push anything else. So you get a round stone. They would get masons to make this wonderful round stone, maybe about, 9 inches to a foot thick, maybe about 5 to 6 feet tall, so that when you're all done interring the very, very wealthy, prominent person, you'd roll the stone in place. It actually would roll slightly downhill, seal the tomb, keep bad people out. That's a very expensive grave. So this man, whom the authorities said deserved to be buried with wicked people in a nameless grave, somehow finds himself being buried in a rich man's tomb. How is that possible? Verse 10, the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. So it was something the Lord had allowed and planned. The Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring, he'll prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Now, this verse messes up your head. You see, the Lord was pleased. How could the Lord be pleased to allow his servant, remember the first verse we read? his servant to be put to death. Why would that please God at all? Does that make any sense? And not only that, he was pleased to crush him and putting him to grief. So the whole process, the whole emotional process of getting to the point of death and the injustice and all that kind of stuff, that entire process of being rejected by man, God says, that's exactly what I have planned. That's what I want to have happen. Well, what kind of king can rule on the earth? What kind of king can bring blessing? What kind of king can subjugate the rulers of the entire earth? How can you do it by doing that? I mean, that's not... You talk to military rulers in ancient times, people like, I forgot his name. Who's the guy that ruled the Mongols? Genghis Khan. There we go, Genghis Khan. All I could think of was Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Genghis Khan. Now, if Genghis Khan left Mongolia, he went out to conquer the world, and he came back and he went out and he got killed, and deliberately he died out there, left his army without anything. And then his army comes back to Mongolia, and they ask, how did it go? Well, Genghis went out, and he suffered the injustices of all those people were with, and he died. Woohoo! Victory's ours. They'd say, no, that's not a military victory, you idiot. Ask Bill and Ted. They know better than that. But this military guy, this king of all kings, finds deliberate victory in going down in defeat rather than up in conquest. See how this doesn't make any sense? But not only that, the very last section of this really twists your mind up. Because we know that this guy's going to die. He's going to go into a grave. But it says, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. That prolong his days means life. Wait, I thought you said he was going to die. Well, God's going to see to it that his days are prosperous and long. No way he's going to die. But there will be life. How can you have both those at the same time? That doesn't make any sense, does it? Prosper? Deliberate on God's part? It was God's pleasure? So we summarize this section, Isaiah 53. A couple hundred years before Jesus, this is written. Men wanted to have him buried without honor with wicked men. And yet he was buried with honor in a rich man's tomb. He was never violent. He was never deceitful. Never told a lie. Never tried to bend your impressions by deceiving you. It was all according to God's plans. And in the end, he'll be alive after death. He's going to prolong his days despite the death issue. Making any connections here yet? 200 years before Jesus came. Okay, verse 11. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. This is God. God will see it, be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many as he will bear their iniquities. This is coming up to his summary statement. So, the righteous one is what he's calling this guy. There's no deceit in this guy's mouth. There's no nastiness. This guy seems to have no sin, is what the previous verses said. And yet it says he is the righteous one. But why would a righteous one die intentionally according to the plan of God, everything smoothly going according to schedule? That doesn't make any sense. He's got to be Genghis Khan. But he's not Genghis Khan. He's dying and yet coming to life. God will see it and be satisfied, which means exactly according to plan. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many. He'll bear their iniquities. So again, going back to what we talked about before, his griefs and sorrows are something we created. They're not his. We created those. And we will be justified because he will carry all our wrongdoing. But we benefit. So here's this plan of God, Isaiah is saying. The plan of God is I have this righteous one, I'll call him, whom the kings will shut their lips at. They don't have anything great to say in his presence because that's how high in authority he is. And by the deliberate plan of God, instead of being a Genghis Khan and conquering those kings, he's going to be a suffering servant who will go through anguish through his entire life until he is unjustly killed. And everyone thinks he's a dirtbag, so he ought to be buried with sinners and wicked people, and yet I'm going to put him in a gorgeous rich man's tomb and give him honor in his death. And not only that, but there's life in the picture after that. And that's all Isaiah is saying. I'm just summarizing for you in my own words here. God is satisfied with the results of this righteous one. Many people will be justified from wrongdoing, not just Jews, and he'll do so by taking the penalty for them. Okay, we come to wrap it up. 12. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, And he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death. Let me just stop there for a second. He poured out himself to death. Okay, that's what we suspected earlier on. This was a voluntary allowing of them to take his life, which also implies he probably could have stopped it. But he voluntarily let it happen. Why? Because he was weak, and because he didn't have a character, because he was a milquetoast and he wouldn't stand up and say, excuse me, that's not right. No, not because of any of that stuff, but because he deliberately chose to allow it to happen. This is the one in whom presence kings can't even speak. And he decides to willingly die in order to justify the many because of what they've done wrong. Somehow he purchases for us with his own blood our justification. He interceded for their transgressions. Now I'm standing in front of this scroll of Isaiah, and we're reading this section. And my friend says, ring any bells who this might be? And I said, that sounds a lot like Jesus. He says, yeah, it is Jesus. Who else would God call his righteous one? Who else do we know voluntarily walked his way to his own death and said, this is exactly according to plan? I mean, how many times did he tell his apostles as he's coming to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, this is the plan. The bad people are going to kill me and I'm going to let them, this is the plan. And not only that, but the prophet Isaiah 200 years later said, this is the plan, this is the plan, this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to go down, don't be surprised. And yet my righteous one will die in order to purchase salvation. Not just for the nation of Israel, this Messiah, but for all nations. Remember, blessing many nations? It's going to be a widespread opportunity for mankind to find this salvation, to have it paid on their behalf. Let me read you a couple of verses and we'll quit with these. Well, I can summarize this. He'll be the victor that takes all. That's the booty part in the beginning. He voluntarily died. He allowed himself to be cursed by men, and he took upon himself the penalty for the wrongdoers. So here we are in Isaiah 52, and here's everything we talked about. God's servant, he was successful, great authority, horribly disfigured, blessing many nations, astonishing truth, grew fat from a youth in a hostile environment, not very kingly looking. He was despised by men. He was rejected by men. He had all these sorrows and grief that came from us as a result. It wasn't his fault. It was our fault for everything he went through. God allowed it. His stabbing was for our wrongdoing. He was annihilated for our sin. But we benefit. We're the ones that are healed. It was our wrongdoing. It was our selfish independence, like sheep that go astray. He paid the penalty for us for what we did. He didn't protest. He didn't say a word. It was voluntary. He was separated from life. That is, he was killed. The executioner's stroke was intended for us and not for him. Men had wanted him buried without honor, but he was buried with honor in a rich man's tomb. He was never violent. He was never deceitful in anything he did. Everything went according to God's plans, and yet he will be alive after death, prolong his days, and God says, I'm satisfied with those results, and many people will be justified from wrongdoing. That's Jesus. And Isaiah is telling us this 200 years before Jesus comes. 200 years before Jesus, someone would have read the same scroll that I'm reading right now, which I'm sure many of them did, and would study that section and say, golly, I don't know. That just doesn't make any sense. And yet, 200 years later, after Jesus comes and is born as a baby, the tender shoot growing up in the hostile ground, he becomes who he is. He's not universally accepted. In fact, most people reject him. And then he dies, all according to God. It's exactly Jesus. And Isaiah is saying this has been the plan from the beginning of all creation. It wasn't an accident. Jesus didn't slip up one day, got in trouble with the authorities, and they killed him. Oh, that's too bad. This was the conscious plan of God on our behalf that we might have our sins taken care of by him. Is he still the king? To whom all the kings won't even be able to say a snappy little comeback? Yeah, he is. Is he alive? Well, how do we know he's alive? Easter morning. That's why everything hinged on the resurrection day. Everything. Because if he didn't come back to life, Isaiah was wrong. And if he didn't come back to life, he was wrong. You realize Jesus banked his entire reputation on coming back to life after he died? He told people, I'll die. And 3 days later, I'll be alive. And if it didn't happen, say the third day comes, no resurrection. Fourth day comes, no resurrection. Fifth day comes, no resurrection. A month goes by, no resurrection. A year goes by, no resurrection. Then you know what you could say about everything Jesus taught when he walked for the 3 years on the earth? He was a hoax. It doesn't matter what good stuff he taught, doesn't matter how really cool it was, how much you venerate the wisdom of what he said, he is a hoax. Everything he said can't be trusted. Because he said, I am such a different person than you can understand that when I die, 3 days later I'm going to come back from the dead. And if that didn't happen, he's not who he says he is. But it did happen. That's why the resurrection is so important. That's why he fits in right here. This is the righteous one from Isaiah, prophesied hundreds of years. How do we know hundreds of years? Because we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're dated before Jesus. There's something else in the Dead Sea Scrolls that flummox biblical prophecy types. The book of Daniel is also in there. And in the book of Daniel, in those Dead Sea Scrolls, right in there, it tells a prediction about when the righteous one will come. HaMashiach Magid is what he's called, the Messiah Prince. He's going to come, and Daniel actually says, here's a timetable. Do your math, and you can figure it out. And you add up the years, you get down here, and ends up to the day being the very day that Jesus came into Jerusalem on the donkey at the beginning of the Passion Week. He comes in as a prince, as a king. That's also in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, critics of the Bible would say, that's so accurate, someone must have added that to the Bible after Jesus. Made it look kind of cool. Look, here's a prediction. And then they found the Dead Sea Scrolls and went, oh, he really did write that. Now, Daniel wrote it more than a couple hundred years. He wrote it many years before. But we have a copy of it from about 200 BC, and there it is in black and white before he ever came. It's right there. So when I looked at these things, I realized, my gosh, my belief in who God is and who Jesus is isn't just wishful thinking. It's built on some undeniable pieces of scriptures found in a cave in Qumran in 1947 that we know for without a shadow of a doubt preceded Jesus and yet predicted Jesus and what he was going to do and what his mission was and what his purpose was and what the benefit to us was to a T. To a T. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So we know we have an accurate thing. I'm going to wrap this up right now. Let me give you a couple verses. Oh boy, I'm not going to. We already looked at all these. Keep going. Oh, okay. This guy actually is Jesus. And let me read for you something that Paul wrote. Whoops, I won't. There you go. He's acting kind of queasy today. Hello. There he is. No, that's not the one I wanted. Go back. That's the one. He wrote a letter to the church in Galatia. And near the end of the close of the letter, Paul says this. He said, when the fullness of time came, remember the timeline? When the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those, that is, purchase us, those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. So this Jesus, Paul says, is the righteous one from Isaiah. He came, and what he did, what he voluntarily gave up on our behalf, he purchased us. That's what redeem means. He purchased us. Why? So that we can become sons of God. Adopted sons in that sense. Because before that point, you're not sons of God. You might have been created by him as your creator, but you are not his children. That's what he's saying. We can become adopted because of what Jesus does after that point. And then John also writes at the beginning of John, as many as received him, Jesus, to them he gave the right to become, there it is, to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And John will continue to harp more and more about the believing in his name part. Here's the whole offer. This is the deliberate point of all history, coming in the fullness of time. This is God's plan. He wants you to be one of his children. The problem is, you're not one of his children. You are his creation, but you're not one of his children. Or else those two verses wouldn't have been written the way they are. But here he says you can become one of his children if you do what? If you believe who he is. If you believe he is the Isaiah righteous one who died on our behalf, the one who's King of kings and Lord of lords, the one in whose presence all the kings of the earth won't even be able to say anything. They'll be silent. He is so authoritative. And yet voluntarily died on our behalf. If you believe that's who he is, and that he died for you, and then it's impossible for you to die for yourself, but he did it for you, and you accept that by faith, then he says, great, Now you're my child. And the king who died raises again to life, establishes his kingdom. We as his children are part of his kingdom, and we have a great hope and a great calling for what he's done. That's what Isaiah has been trying to say all along. It's not about working your way to heaven. It's not about trying to impress God with who you are. It turns out that God already knew how bad we were. It says that Jesus came and he took on himself our stupid wrongdoing and voluntarily died because of that. God knows how dirty we are. But if you're willing to let him pay the price on your behalf and you accept who he is and say, that's what I wanted all my life, then you can become his child. It's really as simple as that. Isaiah made it very clear. No other hoops to jump through. Paul made it very clear in his letters to the Galatians and to the Romans. The Apostle John makes it very clear throughout his entire gospel. Remember, Nicodemus comes at night, a very righteous man, according to the Pharisaical idea of righteous, comes into the cover of darkness so no one will see him. And he comes to Jesus. He says, I know you're a great teacher. And Jesus says, listen, Nicodemus, here's the deal. You have to be born again. You got to start over. You think you're real hot stuff right now, being where you are in the faith. You just got to start over. And he says, and here's the nutshell, the whole nutshell from the Old Testament to the New. God so loved the world. He told us in Nicodemus, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in who he is won't perish but have everlasting life. That's the nutshell. And the call to us, believe, trust, put your faith in him. And then you're his child. From that point on, we do undergo radical change in terms of what we do and what we love and things like that. God is actually in the process of regenerating us after we make that decision. I made that decision almost 39 years ago, and he's been radically reforming who I am as a result. And he'll radically reform you. And now we do what we do out of love for him in response, and not because we're trying to earn our way into his sonship that we could never earn. Sometimes it looks like we do the same thing. But now we do it out of love because we just can't stop ourselves. That's the difference. Now today, I've run kind of long. I had that realization as I stood in front of that Isaiah text that nothing is accidental in God's kingdom. He's been planning for the coming of the Messiah since before Isaiah wrote his scroll 500, 600 years before Jesus. He had it all figured out. And as I stood before that scroll, I realized that I was one of the luckiest people in the world because God brought that promise to me. And here I was looking at a document that in a way almost said, Jim, you're included in this almost 2,000 years from now, the promise. And you can be too. I'm going to close this morning, and if you want to be part of that, if you want to be his child and you understand what he's done on your behalf, and you understand that it wasn't just an accident of death that Jesus went through, but the preordained plan of God to buy us back so that we might become his children. Otherwise, we're not his children. Then you can do it in a quiet prayer. So I'm just going to lead us right now, and if you want to say that prayer just between you and God, not between you and me or anyone else, let's just do that right now. So let's just bow our heads. Lord, I really do remember that day, standing in front of that scroll and marveling at the fact that things seem much more organized than I thought they ever were from your perspective. You knew Jesus was coming. You knew why he was coming. And he was coming to pay the price for my sins. It was my grief, my sorrow he bore. Lord, there's some of us here today that have never said that we want you above everything else. That we're tired of trying to earn your pleasure by being good. There's something that tells us that's just a losing venture. And yet if you went to so much trouble to die on our behalf, you took upon yourself our sins, our iniquities, our wrongdoings, our griefs, our sorrows. You took all that stuff on. And your righteous one, Jesus, did that. And Lord, I guess it's pretty obvious there's very little we can do in comparison. So if you're here this morning and you would like to say, God, I want to be your child, then come to him in the quietness of your heart right now and just confess that you are a sinner. You are full of iniquity. You're the very ones in this Isaiah passage that were doing what you did, and he took those wrongdoings on himself. And let him take those from you. And then come to him quietly right now and say, God, I entrust to you, like Jim did 39 years ago, I entrust to you my life, my entire future. I'm yours. You have purchased me with your blood. You have come to bring me into your kingdom, into your family. Lord, I want to be your child through faith. And the grace, the gift that grace is, God will say, welcome. And Lord, I pray that if there's those here this morning whose hearts have been turned to you that way, I pray you'd give them an assurance of the understanding of their new kinship in your family. And Lord, grow them and regenerate them, draw them close to yourself, delight them in the purpose of this entire goal, not just to cleanse us, but to bring us into your presence and fellowship and enjoy who you are. You as our Father, we as your children, you as our sovereign King, we as your citizens, delighted to be called yours. And God, for those of us who've made that decision so many years ago, I pray you'd make fresh to us again today the radical change in the heavens with this resurrection, saying the King is not dead, but the King has died to pay the price. And that our hearts might just jump up in joy because of the incredible news that our sins have been paid on our behalf, that we've been welcomed into your family, and now we have life with you, resurrected with you in the same way that you're resurrected. And now we have fellowship with you from this very second right now. Lord, we are so thankful to be called your children. You are such a loving God, such a near God in so many ways. We pray that you'd continue to call our hearts to you, to deepen our love for you, to delight us in who you are, that you might be the 100% the desire of our hearts in every way, because you never disappoint. You're always faithful. And you love us so much that your Son would die for us. That's still just an astonishing truth. Thank you for the delight of this day, the resurrection news, which continues to reverberate down through the millennia as the world understands something radical, unparalleled in the course of all human history has happened. God himself, Emmanuel, has come down to us and died on our behalf to bring us back to himself. That's astonishing. Thank you, Lord, for this great morning and for your wonderful word and for the power of its simplicity in our lives. Thank you now in Jesus' name. Amen.